my secret, just do something that ain't nobody ever done before, but make it sound like something that's always been there forever.
Welcome to This Filipino American Life, a podcast that explores the nuanced experiences of Filipinos in the United States at iba pa. Hi everybody, this is Ryan Carpio, joined by
Joe Bernardo,
Elaine Delalis,
and
Mike.
producer.
I never know when I'm actually supposed to be on these episodes or not. I'm kind
You're
of
supposed to be
sitting
on
here staring at you guys.
we just wanted to make sure people know Mike's behind the mic.
behind the mic. You're supposed to be on every episode.
Oh god.
Welcome to the show, everybody. Elaine, you want to start off with some shout-outs?
Shout-outs?
Yeah.
Who are we shouting out in this episode? We're going to shout out all the new listeners.
Yay!
Yeah.
Thank you to Filipino 2 at UCLA discussion from 10 to 11:50 for letting me make an announcement in front of your class and pass out flyers. Thank you.
thank you to Ivy Dulay Dalo for passing out flyers at the SC PASA Summit that's going on today.
Yay. So thank you, new college listeners, for listening to us. Subscribe and rate us on iTunes. When you search for us on iTunes, or if you search for Filipino American, we are the number one podcast that shows up.
Number one
of
Numero
5
uno.
or something.
of 3.
But yeah, rate us and like us on iTunes. One day we'll get sponsors and we'll read real ads that are not us saying Tatak Filipino. But yeah, like us on Facebook, This Filipino American Life. Follow us on Twitter at TFAL Podcast. Leave us a voicemail 805-394-8325. 805-394-TFAL. Leave us a message if you have thoughts on the episodes that we talk about.
Right
Or in
on.
general. Or
Yeah,
sing us songs.
We have a lot going on.
I know.
We got it going on.
We do.
You got it all over it. You were going to sing it too, huh?
No, I wasn't. I totally wasn't. But to all you listeners out there, today is actually a really fun episode. We're going to have a guest later on named Catherine Ceniza-Choy. She wrote the book called Empire of Care. And it is going to be an interview on the book, but it's about the immigration of nurses into the United States and the history of kind of how that came about. But before we get to that, I wanted to pose a question to our hosts about nursing.
Yes.
Do you guys have any nurses in your family?
Yes.
Of course.
I get asked all the time.
Do you eat rice?
Well, we get asked all the time about nurses. Like I remember being asked once if my mom was a nurse or if my father was in the military, and I didn't quite understand it until a lot later on in my life because my dad is not in the military and my mom is not a nurse. But anyway,
Yeah. When I got that question too,
Yeah.
I would be like, what do you mean military? And I think, oh, my uncle's in the army. And it wasn't the right answer.
yeah, because they thought Navy, right?
But then they were like, I was like, oh, well, my aunt's a nurse. And then they'd be like, see, I gotcha. Like, oh, yes.
But you have family that's
Yeah,
nurse?
my tita, who's my godmother, and she's like my second mom and helped raise me. She's a nurse. She worked at Kaiser Panorama City for like 30 years, and she retired a couple years ago. So I grew up at Kaiser Panorama City.
Yeah, I remember funny, it was going to Kaiser Panorama City. And there's a ton of Filipino nurses, of course. Mm-hmm. And we were there late night because my uncle was there and he was in ICU. A sad situation, but it was funny because when the Filipino nurses would come would do the shift change, one person started selling like embutido to people.
That might have been one of my aunties.
Because people were like, "Oh, what do you have? What do you have to sell today?" And she says, "Oh, I brought en potato," and she's selling them to all the nurses. It was
What,
pretty
like
cool.
slices or like whole like
No,
logs?
the whole log.
Oh my god! So you had like a cooler full of like embutido logs?
Yeah.
Mike slices.
Like what? Like here, 2 slices.
Depending on what year it was, my aunt might have worked on that floor because she worked in ICU and she worked at CCU, critical care unit. So yeah.
Yeah, I do not. My sister went through kind of a nursing program. She works for the U.S. government now, but she was in a nursing program when we first kind of came to the States. She does give, not anymore because her patient was like a really old man. So out there, if you're listening, But she was a caregiver for a while. But my niece is going, or at least wants to be a nurse. Both of my nieces who are in school now, but no one in my family that I know of. Yeah, I can't really think. Again,
My cousins are studying to be nurses.
Yeah.
Nurses. Yeah.
I have a couple cousins who are nurses.
And so do you think they were part of do you know if they were part of any kind of program that recruits or anything like that?
I don't know. It's a cousin that I've never met. He was in the Philippines. And so I know he recently left and he's got a job in London. So he immigrated there. So he's like the new era or the new, like the new batch of nurses who go out. Like he's a part of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they do any more recruiting, at least in California, for nurses, just because
there's so many.
there's saturation. Yeah, there's so many of us, and like a lot of people go into that field among Filipinos. But I think there's a lot of recruiting in like other states, where there aren't a lot of Filipino nurses.
I think the NCLEX might be harder here in California, because there's so many people who want to work here.
Yeah,
but I know there's so many of my friends, probably who are listening now, who are nurses and who kind of already knew that they wanted to be nurses when they were in high school and college. That was very surprising to me, only because I had no idea what I wanted to be. But there were folks who just, that was what they wanted. They knew as soon as they were going to graduate high school that they were going to go to a nursing program. And, my question has always been, okay, not doctor, but nurse. Like, nurse. I'm like, okay. I had a high school friend male nurse now.
Merce.
He's a Merce. Knew exactly what he wanted to do after college. Went through a nursing program at, I think, APU, and has been a nurse since. So, and I know a few folks who kind of got, maybe not recruited, but by word of mouth, learned the trade and actually went through different programs by way of like people telling them like, this is a good program. I don't know enough about it to comment on it, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of Filipino American nurses out there.
Understatement of 2017.
Where there's a hospital, there's Filipinos.
Well, because the way I learned about it was actually through my being in hospital. Like my mom was in a hospital and noticing that like at Glendale Memorial, for example, bunch of Phil-Am nurses. But I thought it was because I lived in LA. As opposed to it being like an industry with a lot of Filipino Americans. I thought it was just because you live in LA, of course, there are going to be a lot of Filipino Americans doing whatever, X, Y, and Z. So I never really noticed it until later on.
If it wasn't for my tita, it's actually Vince's mom, so our graphic designer. Hey, Vince. If she hadn't come here as a nurse in the 60s or 70s, I don't think my family would have been here because she was part of those programs, I think, that were recruited, and she was first placed in Tennessee. And I didn't know that until way later because I was like, oh yeah, we've been in California our whole lives, right? And she's like, no, I had to drive in snow and it was so scary. So
they could tell you that when they're they're trying to guilt you into stuff.
Probably.
I drove in snow. Really? I did.
Well, it's surprising because she doesn't really like driving. So I'm like, oh. But
there's some holes in that story.
No. But she's the reason why she came in Tennessee, and then my uncle, who's an engineer, moved to Seattle. That's where his job was with Boeing, I think. And so the two of them were the first of my family to come to America.
Okay.
And then my aunt didn't like being in the South, and she didn't like snow. So she moved to California. I don't know why. Maybe some of her friends were moving, and there's other Filipinos. And then when she moved here, my uncle also moved here to LA. And so had they not come to LA, we wouldn't have been here. Like my mom wouldn't have moved here. So it's like I owe it all to a nurse that I'm here.
Yeah, I think we all do. Someone took care of us when we were kids.
Yeah.
Just curious. I went to Omaha, Nebraska, a couple months ago to visit one of my friends' relatives or friends' parents. My friend who passed away. I wanted to visit his parents, and we ended up going to the hospital because my friend's mom got hospitalized.
Oh, that sucks.
Yeah, it's a long story, and I don't want to get into it. But when I walked in the hospital, it was a small town outside of Omaha called Fremont. It's about 30 miles, and it's very, very like white, like any kind of stereotypical Midwestern small town. That's it. And I went to the hospital. And I was looking. Oh, I wonder if there's a Filipino nurse here. And lo and behold, there was one.
Really?
One.
Only one?
Yeah, and fortunately, I didn't get to talk to her. Well, the one on the floor that I was at.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, right. I didn't get to talk to her, but yeah,
That's cool.
Yeah, I was like, wow, there's a Filipino nurse in Fremont, Nebraska. Yeah,
We're everywhere.
yeah, and I know we all know that there's kind of a stereotype that nurses tend to be female, but there's tons and tons of male nurses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you automatically think that's a woman in that profession?
I did for a long time. I think recently that has changed because so many of my cousin's friends and maybe some of my friends, like they're guys and now they're nurses. They're nurses. So I feel like when we were growing up as kids, it was fun. It was not like something that was normal, but now it's getting like more frequent.
Yeah, I mean, even like the way like we watch TV or something,
Yeah.
like in cartoons, usually nurses are women. But at an early age, because I have older brothers, I think I understood that there was the nurse profession that was available to all. So I kind of knew that there were male nurses. Again, in high school, like people like knew that that's what they wanted to be. But I think when I was a lot younger, you automatically kind of think nurse is a woman nurse. So
Yeah.
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 Which
Which
totally
is-
switched.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember, going to the Turu Turu place, DJ Bimingka in
Yeah.
Panama City. And there would be like, during the lunch rush hour, there would be, a bunch of Filipino dudes who are nurses, and they're in their scrubs. And they're all ordering the bad stuff, like lechon kawali, like longanisa.
Mike's
whatever.
favorite thing, lechon kawali.
Yeah. They would order that stuff, or they would be smoking outside, in their scrubs, or like I would play basketball sometimes, and like some of them like just came from their night shift, and they're all nurses. So like, like as I was young, I used to always equate it as a female profession, but now, especially being Filipino American and in the Filipino American community, it's definitely not specifically like a gendered profession in the traditional sense now. Although it's changed, there are still some gendered annotations with it, but no, not really anymore.
Did you ever think of becoming a nurse, or was that ever part of your?
No.
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 Me neither.
Never.
Me neither.
Because I knew that it required like math and science, and those are not my strong points. So I was like, I can barely pass chemistry in high school. How could I even be trusted to give drugs to patients? No way.
Joe.
No, but I think I said this before, but my Lola told me I should have been a nurse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why? Because you're carrying and all that stuff. Or-
No, because I was in Asian American studies. And then she was like, "What are you gonna do with that?"
You should be a
You
nurse.
should have been a nurse.
It's like the overtime pay with Nurse Joe versus the overtime pay with Asian Studies. Asian American. Time and a half, Joe. Me either. I never thought about being one. But let me take the question a little bit further. Were you ever encouraged to be a nurse, or were you encouraged to be a doctor? I imagine more a doctor.
No, I was encouraged to be a lawyer,
Okay.
not a doctor. My brother was encouraged to be a doctor.
Yeah.
I used to say when I was a kid that I wanted to be a doctor, but I didn't want to be a doctor to help people. I wanted to be a doctor because I knew they made lots of money.
Ka-ching.
And so, like, my standard answer as a kid was, I want to be a doctor so I can make a lot of money and I can buy my house, buy my dad a house in Lake Tahoe and my mom a house in Beverly Hills. Like, I wanted to buy them homes into places. Yes, they're separate.
Separate houses.
Separate houses. Because I wanted to be able to take care of my parents. So I thought, if I'm a doctor, I can do that. But like, I didn't have any implication as to what that meant. And then I went to high school and was like, yeah, I can't do science or math, so not gonna happen.
Yeah. Well, it's just kind of interesting to me too. Like, I was always encouraged to be. I guess I wasn't really. I was into the sciences. I was into math and everything. But you know, in my mind, I was like, I'm going to be a doctor, as opposed to like, oh, I'm going to be.
Oh, weren't you a bio major?
I was, and then it didn't happen. But it all goes and kind of plays into this whole idea of like what you're encouraged to do when we were younger, or
Yeah.
even like my sister, for example. I don't think my dad ever said, you know, you should be a doctor. You know, like, but she was interested in that field, but nursing was really attractive to her. You know, so I thought that was kind of interesting.
Do you think you talked about how a lot of your friends knew they were going to be nurses, you know, right after high school? Do you think they did that because they knew it was a safe industry, or like did they aspire to help people, or they just did it because, oh, this is a good solid career?
The people I see that like were my friends that are nurses now, I'm like completely shocked that they are nurses.
Really?
Like, I'm like, you're a nurse?
They're all ex-gangsters.
No, but like, well, yeah, some of them probably are.
Yeah.
Like in college, my friend who's a nurse now, I just remember thinking like, you have bedside manner? Like, you like hate everyone. How is that? You're a nurse? And so that's what I mean. Like, so that's what the people, and then some of the people I know who work in the nursing profession or like in the health related field, I was like, I thought you weren't that smart. Like, I was like, oh, good for you. Right. You were able to do all these things. Cause I just thought like it's hard. And I think that was me putting on my insecurities, like projecting my insecurities on like my science background on other people. Like they obviously could do it. So.
Well, I imagine that it's a bunch of different things, but you know, you got to study for it. It's not like you know, it's definitely a science field that's difficult, you know. But I think that there has been a pathway to it, and what I mean by that is through the networks and you know that people have, and understanding that this is a pathway to a medical field that you don't have to go to med school for. And I think part of it is that perhaps, you know, I'm speculating, but I think that there's just the ones that I know have just known because somebody told them about it, or that there's actually, you know, there's levels and pathways of getting there, and not that it's easy either, but that it's accessible.
Yeah.
As opposed to like, oh man, you know, to be in med school, right? Is kind of it sounds difficult, like becoming, you know, being in med school. Again, not that nursing isn't difficult, but there's different levels to get to becoming an RN. You know, you have a level that gets you to being a licensed vocational nurse, for example. Study while you're earning. You know, like there's a lot of those economic aspects that makes it accessible for folks to be able to do it. And plus, I think we're kind of a caring group of, you know, people. That's why I asked you, like, did your grandma think you were caring, Joe?
No.
Apparently, it was an economic driven question.
All about the money.
It's all about the money. Yeah, I don't know about that caring part.
Fine.
Screw
Yeah, it's
you.
funny. My friend, he's in charge of a youth group up in Stockton. Dylan Delvo, shout out to you if you're listening. He posed the question to his students, to his youth, like how many of you are thinking of or going to be thinking of doing nursing after you graduate? And like 90% of the people,
Really?
like they're all Filipino, right?
90%.
Yeah.
Most for Filipino.
Yeah.
They raised their hands, and And then he asked a follow-up question. He said, of the people who raised their hands, how many people are doing it because they want to help people and they want to help people get well? And most of those people put down their hands.
Yeah.
And it's like it's a fallback.
Yeah.
You know, it's a safe industry.
Like, you can be a nurse. You can be a nurse.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. And I don't know. Do you think that's good for the Filipino community?
I don't think it's even like Filipino community related. Like, if you're going to go into nursing, I would like to hope you're doing it because you want to be in a caring profession. Because if all you're doing is like you're seeing dollar signs, I feel like your quality of care, like what is that going to be as a patient?
Yeah.
What would be your quality of care? Like, I want my nurse to like actually like care about me, not to be like, oh, I just gotta get you through, you know, which a lot of times you can feel like that's what's happening because they see so many people.
Do I think it's good? Here's what I think.
And good, you know,
Yeah.
it's a loaded question.
Of course.
Yeah.
I think it's a healthy industry, but I think it's a healthy conversation to have with folks who are definitely interested in it. Like, there's two aspects that I want to look at this, the lens of, right? If you want to be a nurse, you should be a nurse. Like, you should study to be a nurse because you are caring, or you seek the profession because it fits the way you see it as a career, right? Like with anything else, right? There was a time, however, when I would say to my niece, why nurse and why not doctor, right? And I said that to her because I wanted it to be not a conversation of it being a fallback. You know, if you do want to be a nurse, then great. I think if the conversation is not that, you know, not that it's easy, not that there's a way to get there, of course you should be able to pursue what you want to pursue. So in one sense, we want to say that if you want to be whatever you want to be, you should have the ability to do that. But for it to have that effect on people who are like, actually, you know, I don't really care. I care more about the money. I think that's bad in all respects, not just in the nursing profession. I don't want to, you know, I'm not belittling the profession at all. I think it's actually really, really good. But there was a reason why I asked, you know, my niece who was interested in the medical field to not want to pursue being a doctor. You know, I've always wondered I'm like, why not doctor? You know, why not? Why nurse?
You sound like a dad, dude.
I know. But I did ask her, but she was like, I want to be a nurse. I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. You know, but there was, you know, there's almost another conversation to be had about that if we want to eliminate it from a fallback profession. If it's not a fallback profession, if we don't want it to be that, I think the conversation should always be then, you know, be the best damn nurse you can be. But it has, I think what you pointed out, Joe, is that it has become that conversational kind of vocation, right? For folks to be able to say, you know, I can do this, you know, at this stage in my life, let's, you know, fall back on it.
It's just so hard.
Nursing?
Yeah.
I agree. I don't know if I could do it.
There's so much you have to do. Like, you're giving, like, I think people think like, oh, nurses are just like, you know, they help you, they care for you. But like, what does care for you mean? Like, care for you means like you're emptying bedpans and you're washing people, like giving sponge baths, and you're taking everyone's blood pressure. Like, it's so hard. Like, the work, like, props to you who, if you're a nurse and you're listening right now, you are doing the Lord's work, because I could not do that.
Yeah, yeah. And this is not to say that like, if you're just settling to become a nurse, it's just more about, you know, is your heart really into it, or is it about the paycheck? And which is good, you know, if you need the paycheck and you figure out nursing is good, then that's good. That's good. You make more money than I do.
And me.
Right. Well, so just to kind of piggyback on that conversation about fallback, right? I remember in college, I had maybe a handful of friends who didn't know what to do after college, after graduating undergrad. I knew four of them that said, I'm going to take the LSATs to become a lawyer or to go to law school. and with no passion for the law or even wanting to be a lawyer, but they just didn't know what to do. One of them is someone I went out with, who I knew well, and I was like asking her, I was like, why are you doing this? And she's like, I have no idea what I want to do. And so there was actually a debate with her and another person who was like really wanted to get into a good law school but studying for it. And there was frustration in there and saying, you don't even want to do this. Why are you doing this kind of thing? So it was just a very interesting conversation.
Hey, Mike, does that sound familiar?
What?
Taking the LSATs because you don't know what you want to do.
Oh, totally different subject.
but I
Another
mean,
subject for another day.
But I mean, we can call that out with any profession, I guess.
Yeah.
Is what I'm saying. And,
But it happens to be
right.
the thing in our community.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I do have a kind of a funny joke about not a joke, but like my uncle used to always say like, why did the patient the hospital stop
I'm
it?
already laughing.
Can't wait.
I don't even know what it is. I'm already
Wait.
laughing.
Do it. Say
Oh my
it.
gosh.
Why did the patient complain about Filipinos speaking in their language at the in the hospital?
What? Why?
Because they kept saying that he's gonna die. Ay nako, die! She's gonna die!
Mike, I'm looking at Mike's face and shaking his head.
Wag ka ganyan, die!
There's a lot of Messiah nurses in that hospital.
Oh my goodness gracious. Oh my goodness.
But seriously, I mean, there's been instances where hospitals have banned the use of Tagalog or any kind of Filipino language in hospitals.
I've seen articles.
That happened in Delano a few years ago. That's the most recent case, and yeah, that sucks because they can't speak their own language
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
amongst
weird.
people. Yeah, but yeah, if they're Visayan, they keep on saying die. I can kind of understand when people like say they don't want that. Why is it saying die? Everybody say they're gonna die.
No, it's in die. Oh my gosh. Poor people.
Yeah.
Do you guys ever kind of wonder in the hospital or TV shoast why there are no Filipino nurses like in ER?
I totally do.
Because they're racist.
I always thought about that.
Because it's
Didn't Chicago Hope at least have one?
I don't remember.
I remember back in back in the day, people complained about ER had like no Filipino nurses.
Yeah.
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 And it'd be like, that's not a real
I know,
hospital.
it's not real. Like, this isn't
Yeah,
realistic.
they're in Chicago too, right?
know.
Yeah.
Like-
Everybody should be Filipino.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I'm like, I never knew there was a,
Or like in the soap opera General Hospital, why there was no Filipino
Come on,
nurses there. I mean, come on.
I think only later did they have like an Indian doctor. Like, come on, there has to be at least 20% Indian
all of
doctors.
those shows, I would be like, this is not real.
Yeah.
No Indian doctor, no Filipino nurse.
But Big Bang Theory actually had an episode where they hired a Filipino caregiver.
That's pretty accurate.
Yeah, that's super
cool.
accurate. Actually, I think is some of the crew members in Big Bang Theory is Filipino.
So that makes sense, and the only reason why I think that makes sense is because they're pretty accurate on getting things done right.
Yeah.
Like one of the faculty that I used to work with is a consultant on the show.
yeah.
So like all the math is right.
Yeah.
The writers actually based the characters on old grad students. And the apartment that they live in is based on a grad student's apartment.
That's so cool.
So like that to me makes sense that they would actually have a caregiver. And like, yeah, that's for Big Bang Theory, but it's also not that great a show anymore. But yeah.
Yeah, it's not as good.
Yeah.
Not as good.
As we're whispering, but people can hear us.
But yeah, Hollywood, get your facts right.
About
please.
hospitals.
About
Filipino nurses in
diversity.
your medical shows.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you guys. But we will be right back to talk about a book called Empire of Care with Catherine Ceniza-Choy. Thanks for listening, everyone.
See you in a bit.
And we're back. Hi, TFAL listeners. Today we have a special guest. Catherine Ceniza-Choy is with us today and here to talk about her book, award-winning book called Empire of Care, Nursing and Migration in Filipino American History. Catherine is a professor and former chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. Go Bears. And she is here with us today to talk about our topic, which is nursing. And we want to say welcome to Catherine. Hi, welcome, Catherine.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Love that you're here with us. And again, thank you for making time to talk to us today. And I wanted to just start off by talking a little bit about your book. Do you have give us a quick summary of what Empire of Care is about?
Well, Empire of Care was based on my dissertation, and it became my first book. It's the first book-length study of the history of Filipino nurse migration to the United States. And one of the things that made it unique was that I did research in both the United States and the Philippines to explore how and why the Philippines became the world's leading exporter of professional nurses, and especially nurses to the United States.
And how did you get into that topic? Was it kind of like was it a realization when, being a Filipino American, maybe were you surrounded by nurses, or did you discover that there's a lot of Filipino nurses in the States? But how did you come up with a dissertation on nurses?
It was very much something that was personal, a personal realization, as well as something that was also intellectual and scholarly. Mm-hmm. But I'm a second generation Filipino American. My parents are Filipino immigrants who met in New York City, and I was born and raised in New York City. And I was aware at a very young age, while I was growing up, that Filipino immigrant nurses were an important part of the Filipino American community in New York City. I lived and grew up in a neighborhood called Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village in Lower East Side Manhattan. And I grew up in a building where a number of Filipino nurses lived because my neighborhood was surrounded by a cluster of hospitals. Beth Israel Hospital, Bellevue Hospital, the VA Hospital, New York Ioneer. So it was something I had grown up with. I didn't plan to become a historian. I didn't even know what that was when I was growing up. But when I went to college, I left New York and I went to a small liberal arts college in Claremont, California called Pomona College.
I know that school.
And when I attended Pomona College, I already had this interest and growing love for history. But I also felt as though Filipinos and Filipino Americans were not well represented in history in general as it was being taught in high school and college. And even in American history, even though I was aware that the Philippines had been an official U.S. colony, and even though I had been aware that the U.S.-Philippine relationship was so important in terms of not only colonialism, but also in terms of immigration and in terms of healthcare, because of my experiences as a child growing up in New York City and seeing all those Filipino immigrant nurses. So there was something very personal, but there was also something scholarly. And I felt that I loved history, but I didn't see my family. I didn't see my community in that history. And I realized on a scholarly, intellectual level that it's one thing to critique that absence of representation, but if I want to critique it, I need to also do something about it. And I need to do the research and writing that I want to see that wasn't there in American and even Asian American history at at that time, which was the 1990s.
Yeah, we certainly have I do, a new appreciation for history and recognizing Filipino American history or lack thereof. We have a fellow historian here, Joe Bernardo.
Hi, Joe.
Who is also, wrote his dissertation on historic Filipino town. And so I think that, I love the thought process that came into, your book, and I really enjoyed reading it. And I have a kind of a fun question. I love the title, Empire of Care. What made you title it that, like the Empire of Care? What led to that title, and in the beginning or in the end?
Yeah, thanks so much for saying that you like the title. It was hard for me to come up with that title, and I need to give credit to conversations I had with Philippine historian Vicente Rafael, who currently is in the history department at the University of Washington. And I told him I was having trouble coming up with the title. And what he reminded me was, you need to have a title that speaks to the most important aspects of the book. And so care is really important because nursing is a form of care work. And it's something that we need to value as a form of labor. And so I wanted to have care in the title to reflect that important value and contribution of nursing and of all nurses. The empire part was the other piece that was really important. And empire in the sense that it would reflect one of the major arguments in my book. And one of the major arguments I make in the book is that in order to understand how and why the Philippines became the world's leading exporter of nurses, and especially nurses to the United States, we have to really understand the history of the United States as an empire, the United States as an imperial nation, and that the United States colonized officially the Philippines from 1898 to 1946. And that history has deep consequences. And one of those consequences is that the U.S. colonial government established an Americanized educational system in the Philippines that taught so many Filipinos the English language, but also included Americanized nursing training. And so from the early 20th century, the U.S. colonial government started training Filipino nurses in a very Americanized nursing curriculum. And although it wasn't their intention at that time in the early 1900s to export Filipino nurses to the United States as workers per se, that was one of the consequences of this history of U.S. colonialism, which is that Filipino nurses became prepared. They were well prepared to alleviate critical nursing shortages in the United States in the post-World War II period. So empire in the title, Empire of Care, refers to that very important earlier history of U.S. colonialism in the Philippines. But I also used Empire of Care to talk about not only past inequalities, but also talk about present inequalities. And I wanted the Empire of Care to also signify that this international migration is one that's historically important, but it's also controversial. You have the Philippines sending highly skilled nurses to the United States. And the United States, in the second half of the 20th century, has had better nurse-to-patient ratios than nurse-to-patient ratios in the Philippines. So, in other words, there's greater need for nursing services in the Philippines, especially in rural areas, especially in poor areas. But what this migration does is it sends among the best and the brightest professionals from the Philippines. It sends them to places like the United States. So that explains. I hope that explains the choice of the particular terms in the title "Empire of Care."
Absolutely.
Totally.
Yeah, because it's also you understand it's a transnational effect. You know, it's not just immigrants coming here for a better place, but it's actually larger historical forces that caused kind of the push factors and caused this sprouting up of Filipino nurses in the Philippines to come here. So I actually wanted to ask you about just a little bit more detail on how the American educational system created this nursing industry in the Philippines.
Sure. Well, I wanted to say, Joe, I think that's such an important point that you were making earlier, that this is very much a transnational history, and that Filipino nurse migration to the United States needs to be understood as a transnational phenomenon. And we often think of Filipino nurse migration and other kinds of contemporary migration to the U.S. as something unidirectional, in which migrants from around the world, they want to come to the United States, and that they want something from the United States, whether it's jobs or general socioeconomic mobility. And there's some truth to that, but it's actually more accurate to explain migration in a transnational framework, because oftentimes it's the United States establishing a presence in countries throughout the world, in countries like the Philippines, establishing a presence through colonialism, a colonial government, Americanized nursing school, and creating desire from young Filipino women to eventually travel, study, work, pursue professional opportunities in the United States. I remember I interviewed over 40 Filipino nurses who had trained in the Philippines but were working as registered nurses in New York City hospitals. And one of them, I remember, who I interviewed, she said, well, when we studied, even in grade school in the Philippines, we had books that said A is for apple, even though apples were not common in the Philippines, didn't grow there. And so there's this desire to practice and pursue further education in the United States for professional but also cultural reasons. And nurses would tell me, for example, they were exposed to things like American candy, like M&Ms, and they would learn about snow, even though, like apples, you don't have snow in the Philippines. And they wanted to experience these things because they learned about it through U.S. colonial. So I think there's very much a transnational aspect to U.S. immigration that we may not often think about right away, but is definitely there. And to get to your question about white American women traveling and working in the Philippines in the early 20th century, that's absolutely historically true, that you had both white American men and women going to the Philippines to teach an Americanized curriculum, to teach English language, for example. But you had American women specifically coming to the Philippines in the early 1900s to train specifically young Filipino women in the nursing profession. So that was definitely a historical phenomenon of white women coming to the Philippines in the early 1900s. And one of their unique roles as white American women was to train young Filipino women in Americanized nursing.
In some of your chapters, you talked about the initial migration of Filipino nurses, Philippine trained nurses to the United States, especially through the Cold War program, the exchange visitor program. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In my book, Empire of Care, I talk about how Filipino nurse migration has a longer history, that it just doesn't begin in the late 20th century or early 21st century. So even in the early 20th century, you had a few Filipino nurses coming to the United States primarily as students who were trying to learn more about Americanized nursing within the United States. But they were few in number. Most of them returned to the Philippines. But starting in the late 1940s, the U.S. government created this exchange visitor program. And the exchange visitor program was a Cold War program. The idea was that the United States would recruit the best and brightest students from around the world, and that they would learn about American democracy and freedom and American way of life in the United States. And then they would return to their countries of origin and spread their knowledge of American values. And in this kind of exchange, they would become like ambassadors for the United States. And what happened is that the exchange visitor program coincided with American nursing shortages in the post-World War II period. And so American hospitals started to utilize the exchange visitor program not solely to train or expose Filipino nurses specifically to American values, but to have Filipino nurses work to alleviate critical nursing shortages. So this is an example of how there are at times unintended consequences of historical programs and policies. And the exchange visitor program, it was supposed to be a program that would attract students from around the world, but most of the exchange visitors started coming from the Philippines, and American hospitals started to recruit specifically Filipino nurses to not only study, but also work in their hospitals. So this was a transformation, and in many cases, an abuse of the exchange visitor program. For the Filipino exchange nurses involved, however, a number of them did critique some of the exploitive aspects of the exchange visitor program. But for some of them, they were able to study and to learn more about American nursing. And it started to expose them to opportunities, professional opportunities to work as nurses in the United States. So it also had this effect of exposing those Filipino nurses to nursing and life in the U.S. And a number of those Filipino nurses didn't want to return to the Philippines. Or if they returned to the Philippines, they wanted to come back to the United States for multiple reasons: professional reasons, cultural reasons, financial reasons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of also talk about, you also kind of talk about how a lot of those people who did the exchange program kind of adopted the belief that of like U.S. economic and medical superiority. They basically believe that, you know, the West is better and the Philippines, the one we left behind, was backward. How does that, you know, perpetuate empire, perpetuate, you know, racial superiority, hierarchy, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that based on my research, what I found was that when those Filipino exchange nurses, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, when they experienced working as a nurse in American hospitals, some of them did develop attitudes that created, if not perpetuated, a hierarchy that had existed from the early 20th century. A hierarchy that was created out of the U.S. colonization of the Philippines, in which American public health and education was considered superior to Philippine health delivery, Philippine education. And in this case, the exchange program, we're now talking about the mid-20th century. Instead of having, let's say, white American nurses going to the Philippines and perpetuating and popularizing some of these superior attitudes, during the exchange visitor program in the mid-20th century, you did have some Filipino exchange nurses perpetuating those kinds of superior attitudes that in which there is this hierarchy between the United States and the Philippines, with the United States on top, superior in terms of healthcare practice and delivery. I do think, though, we need to temper this, what I'm saying, with also some socioeconomic and socio-historical context. And so I don't mean to say that those Filipino exchange nurses were racist or that they necessarily felt superior to other Filipinos. I do think we have to understand historical actors, and in this case, Filipino nurses, as historical actors on their own terms. And one of the things they experienced in the United States is that they were able to make money in American dollars, in US dollars. And during this time period, you start to see the beginning of the devaluation of the Philippine peso. And so they were able to have a more financially secure lifestyle in some ways because they were earning in US dollars. They were also working in American hospitals where they were exposed to, at that time, what had been more modern equipment, what had been disposable tubes, for example, or other kinds of nursing materials in US hospitals, which were not available in the Philippines. And so they were making these comparisons at the time because there were inequalities that existed at that time between US and Philippine hospitals.
But kind of this adoption of like Western medicine or kind of Western ways of giving care also, marginalizes like indigenous care, like herbolarias, or what's it called? Arbolarias or manhihilo, stuff that for a long time Filipinos have been doing. Midwifery, for example. I have stories where like I know some of my aunties who are Filipino who kind of just dismiss these things because it's not
it's not Western medicine.
It's not Western medicine and stuff. So yeah, I guess where I'm going with that is that that's how I guess empire kind of white supremacy kind of perpetuates itself, is with people who are marginalized, I guess, not necessarily adopting these kind of values, but in a sense from their own kind of vantage point, it creates even more stark, reinforces like this hierarchy.
I think that's an important point. And I think that emerges with U.S. colonialism in the Philippines. And I think that was one of the U.S. colonial agendas, was to impose Western medicine and Western medical practices because American colonizers felt that those practices were superior. So I I do think you bring up a good point that there is a racialized and colonial hierarchy between Western medicine and indigenous healthcare practices. I do think as the 20th century, and we're now living in the 21st century, that we do have more recognition of indigenous and alternative healthcare practices, even though, yes, there still continues to be racist attitudes regarding this kind of hierarchy between medical practices. But I do think there's more of an acknowledgement now that westernized medicine is not the answer for everyone's ills.
Yeah.
So I do think we have different ways of approaching healthcare and health problems and just the issue of wellness in general.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was marketed really well. The idea of nursing in the States, and what I really liked about the book was it was like Mad Men. You know, it was like advertised as an adventure at some point, and I was like just reading it as a kind of like come to America, and it was like this advertisement. You know, I mean, we talk about it as imposing, but you know, it was very attractive, and I imagine there was a lot of folks out there who were like attracted to this idea. It was marketed towards women, and the idea of making more money. So I really enjoyed that part. But I think Elaine has a question for you.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you wrote this question down because this actually it pertains to somebody that I knew from college. So in chapter 5 of your book, you talk about 2 murder cases and America's wound culture. Can you explain a little bit about the 2 cases and what they meant towards the Americans' culture and perceptions of the Filipino nurses? And the reason this is personal to me is that one of these nurses is somebody I knew in college's mother. It's Perez, yeah, JP. It's his mom. So I saw him at a recent event, and he mentioned this, and I was like, "Oh, this is serendipitous because we're going to be talking to you." We had already knew we were talking to you, and he was like, "Yeah, that's my mom," and I'm like, "I had no idea. This is crazy." So I would just love your perspective on that.
Okay, thanks so much for that question. That chapter on those 2 murder cases involving Filipino nurses was perhaps the hardest chapter for me to write. So in that chapter, what I did was I compared 2 murder cases that had received some kind of media attention. And the first was a 1966 massacre of student nurses in Chicago. Sometimes it's referred to as the Richard Speck massacre because Richard Speck was the mass murderer of that heinous crime. And 2 of his victims were Filipino exchange nurses. And the only survivor was also a Filipino exchange nurse, Corazon Amorao. And she not only survived, but she was very brave and became the star witness in the prosecution that was able to convict Richard Speck. And so I talked about that particular case and contrasted it with a later case, a 1975 case that took place in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and involved multiple deaths from respiratory arrest in the VA or Veterans Administration Hospital there. And what was different about that particular case is that the Filipino nurses involved were not the victims of the crime, but were accused as the perpetrators of that crime. The 2 nurses involved, Filipina Narciso and Leonora Perez, were both Filipino immigrant nurses, as opposed to the exchange visitor nurses involved in the Speck case. And Narciso and Perez were convicted on the most circumstantial of evidence. Thankfully, later they were acquitted. But that happened after activism, after protest, after Filipino nurses and other Filipino immigrants organized in the United States, and also to a certain extent and also in the Philippines as well, in order to raise money for Narciso and Perez to obtain a proper defense. And it's really a stunning case. And this was really hard for me to do the research for these two cases because there was violence involved, very gruesome violence in the Speck case that was difficult to confront. It was also difficult to confront how the Speck massacre became highly sensationalized. And so there's a disturbing American fascination with violence against women. And as I was doing research for that case, I also confronted that violence, but then also this fascination with the mass murderer in a way that becomes more important than the victims and the survivor. And that was hard. That was hard personally as a researcher and then a writer to think about. And then the VA case was also very difficult because as I was doing research on that case, I confronted how circumstantial that evidence was against those two Filipino immigrant nurses, Narciso and Perez. And I was stunned, as I think they were at the time, and their families and communities at the time. I was stunned that they were convicted on such minimal evidence. So, for example, they were convicted because they were seen near the patients or at the scene of the crime, but they were nurses working there. So that was part of their job to be there. And another piece of evidence that was used against them was eyewitness testimony from a witness who said in his testimony that he had a hard time telling Asians apart, that they all looked alike to him. Wow. Oh, and I thought, this is incredible. So there was a lot of, for me, confronting that evidence was heartbreaking in the sense that I felt this was so unjust. And I think the redemption, and I do think there is redemption in the VA case, which is that the Filipino community in the United States and the Philippines organized to support these women, and that these women survived their conviction. I think this case was very difficult for them, but they were able to become free and to continue living their lives. So I just wanted to add one more thing, which is why look at these two cases aside from their popularity. And one of the main reasons why I looked at these cases was to show how U.S. colonialism, and especially in terms of its stereotypes of Filipinos as, on the one hand, caring, but on the other hand, savages, how those stereotypes continue even into the second half of the 20th century. And I do think that those two nurses, Narciso and Perez, who were convicted, but then later acquitted, I think part of their conviction was the result of certain kinds of stereotypes and controlling images about Filipinos as savage and uncivilized. And I wanted to bring that out, that persistence of racialized stereotypes in more contemporary times.
So that actually kind of brings me to the next question about, Filipinos' racialized stereotype as being hospitable. That tends to be like a general narrative about Filipinos. Do you think that comes from kind of Filipinos in the nursing industry, or was that an earlier trope from American soldiers in the Philippines, etc., American colonial presence in the Philippines?
Okay.
Or was it
Yeah.
just reinforced by the nursing industry?
Well, I think that hospitality and that kind of kindness, I think a number of Filipinos and Filipino Americans would say that that's an important Filipino value. And for me, I think nursing it's related more to caring, and that there is a connection there with hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
So on one level, I think you're right. But I think there is a bit of a distinction between caring and hospitality.
Okay.
For me, caring is something that's that the problem with stereotypes in general is that they're one-dimensional. The problem with stereotypes is that they flatten a group of people, and caring as a positive stereotype.
Uh-huh.
And the problem with that is all stereotypes flatten people. They don't give you a multidimensionality. In the Philippine case, especially in relation to nursing, caring is not just a racialized stereotype. I think it's also a gendered stereotype.
Uh-huh. Absolutely.
And so there's that stereotype that Filipino women in particular can become nurses, not because of their education or their training, but because of this innate ability of Filipino women to be caring. And I think while some people might think of that as a positive stereotype, I think we also need to be careful about it, because the idea or this historical phenomenon of Filipino women becoming nurses was something that was actively created by U.S. colonialism in the Philippines in the early 20th century. And it's based on this stereotype from the 19th and early 20th century that in order to be a civilized nation, one had to have separate spheres in which men did certain kinds of work and women did certain kinds of work. And so with nursing, Americans at that time believed that in a civilized nation, women should do nursing work, not men. And that's why U.S. colonial hospitals that train nurses actively recruited young women as opposed to men. And even though there were men who were practicing nursing and interested in nursing in the early 20th century, they were discouraged by the U.S. colonial hospitals from pursuing nursing as a profession.
So they made it women's work. Like they redefined U.S. colonialism and imperialism redefined what women's work was towards Filipinos, because historically in the Philippines, at least from my understanding and my own reading, like women had like leadership roles, and not to say that nurses aren't leaders, but there was no division in terms of what type of work there was, like men's work, women's work. It was all like the people's work. That's what you did. And so by having them come and bring this new job or new career to the Philippines, it created this like patriarchy in a society that was more matriarchal to begin with.
Oh, it was always there, even with the Spanish.
Well, yeah, it just made it worse.
I think, though, that's an interesting conversation. I think, though, what's interesting is that there are interpretations of U.S. colonialism that make it seem as though they were liberating and giving freedom to Filipino women. And what I want to point out, which is a point that I think is coming up here, is that U.S. colonialism did create different kinds of what they considered to be appropriate work for Filipino women and for Filipino men. And they did very much actively shape this idea that a nurse has to be a woman.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it persists to this day, even though you do have more men certainly entering the profession in general.
Okay. So, the book was published back in 2003, and it was 14 years ago now. Even though it's still like very timely, it's still very much present in our day. But how would you write the book today if you had to do it over again?
Oh my gosh, that's a fascinating question.
Like, 'cause, for example, we talked earlier, we amongst ourselves talked about earlier how, young Filipino Americans who are kind of looking for their own careers tend to, we know a lot of folks who go into nursing because they have
it's
fewer
safe.
options. It's safer. It's kind of a fallback profession. I have relatives who just came from the Philippines. They had aspirations to pursue a career, but then they end up, becoming nurses. That would just be my idea of something that would be more present. But yeah, for you, if you had to write the book today, what would you kind of add to it? Add to the narrative?
Yeah. There are a number of things I would add to the narrative. The first is something we were just talking about, which is the role and presence of Filipino men in the nursing profession. So I would love to, if I had the opportunity to add to the book, I would like to do that. I actually did interview a few Filipino male nurses, and when I was doing research for Empire of Care, and it would be wonderful to include their stories, as well as to include recent changes of how some Filipino physicians, many of whom are male in the Philippines, have been leaving the medical profession and taking up nursing for job opportunities and for migration opportunities, which Joe, you were alluding to. So that's one thing I'd love to add. The other thing I'd love to add is how the people I talked about in my book were immigrants. They're first generation Filipino Americans who immigrated to the United States to work as nurses. But we now have much larger second, even third generation Filipino Americans. And I would love to add more about how second and third generation Filipino Americans are impacted by having their immigrant parents working as nurses. Do they feel pressured or encouraged to enter nursing because it's a very prominent line of work in the Filipino immigrant community? So hearing about a multi-generational perspective, not just a first generation perspective, I think would be really exciting. And another thing I'd like to add too is that Filipino nurses are migrating to many different parts of the world, to other parts of Asia, like Japan, Singapore. They're migrating to Canada, to European countries like the UK. They're migrating in large numbers more recently to the Middle East. And so I would love to, if I were doing it today, also include that broader diaspora.
Cool. Okay, so this is the last question. So maybe to be end on a lighter note. Part of our goal here in this Filipino American Life is really to shape some of the stories that not a lot of people get to hear or learn from. In the many stories you've seen or encountered in your research, is there anything you can point to as something you really enjoyed learning about?
Okay. Yeah, there are two things I want to mention. One has to do with nursing, and the other one is more broad about Filipino American history and life. With nursing, one of the things that I was surprised about that I learned from my research, especially the interviews with Filipino nurses, is how important their nursing training was, and how important that was because they were able to after their training, wear a nursing uniform and a nursing cap. And in the late 20th century, early 21st century, most nurses aren't doing that as much. But for the nurses that I interviewed, they were part of a number of them were part of a generation where there was a lot of admiration for that uniform and the nursing cap. And the way I understand this is not that it's not superficial. Fashion is not superficial, but rather that uniform and that cap represents education. It represents a certain kind of achievement of their training. And it represents also a contribution to one's community by contributing caring, by contributing healthcare delivery. That is something that all of us should value. So I really loved those stories about how important the nursing cap was.
Oh, that's cool.
And then finally, I just want to add that we need more histories about Filipino American women. And I am currently doing research looking at various biographies of Filipino American women. So,
Awesome.
for example, Encarnacion Alzona, who was a pensionada, a U.S. colonial government sponsored student, but she became the first Filipino woman to earn a PhD. She earned it in history at Columbia University and then went back to the Philippines to become a prolific Philippine historian and a pioneering Philippine women's historian. So I'm looking forward to writing stories like that and stories like the story of Victoria Manalo Draves, for example, a second generation mixed Filipino American woman born to a Filipino father and an English mother, and who, in spite of the racial segregation and racism she encountered, went on to win 2 gold medals in diving at the Olympics in 1948 and became the first woman in history to win gold medals in 2 different diving events. So when I hear these stories, they're so exciting to me, and I'm just looking forward to doing more research and writing about them so that more people know about Filipino and Filipino American women's history and their contributions.
Nice. When is that coming out?
I don't have a specific date. Still researching and writing, but it's been so much fun. Sometimes it's difficult, but it's also so much fun. And I want to encourage listeners to, learn more about our history, and write the history that you want to see, but don't see.
I can't wait for your books or those stories. They'll be great. And so that's a lesson to everybody, all the listeners. Go be PhDs.
Unless there's no jobs after. So, other than writing histories, you yourself have actually made history. After decades of Filipino American student activism, you were the first kind of tenure-tracked professor in specializing in Filipino American studies at Berkeley.
Go Bears.
I know Ryan was part of that activism back in the 90s and
back in the day. So how does it feel? Like, you've been there for how long now? Like more than 10 years. So how does it feel? Don't age her.
Sorry.
I mean, come on.
But you did make history in with your position and your work. So, how does that feel being such a pioneer in that?
Yeah, well, I feel a tremendous sense of gratitude to those activists like Ryan who advocated for that position and advocated really more broadly for the significance of Filipino American studies and Filipino American history at the university and college level. I feel adept in that sense. And then I also feel a great amount of responsibility, but I also feel a great amount of excitement too. There's so much more of Filipino American history that needs to be written. And one person can't do that by himself or herself. So that's why I just want to encourage listeners. I certainly encourage my graduate and undergraduate students to pursue history. And even if they don't become professional historians, to use history to enrich your life and to also give back to our Filipino and Filipino American communities and our broader Philippine and American communities. So in that sense, I think my position is really exciting. I can impart knowledge, but also skills, I hope critical skills that will enable future generations to document, to preserve, and continue to share our very important Filipino American history.
Cool. Thank you so much.
This has been amazing.
This is really, really good. And so for all you listeners out there, we're going to find out what's the best way to get a hold of Empire of Care by Catherine Ceniza-Choy. What's the best way to get a hold of that book? How do they get it and how do they order it?
I think the best way or most accessible way is to go to Amazon.com because the book is available through Amazon.
There you go. And please read it so that when your non-Filipino friends ask you, why are there so many Filipino nurses, you can actually teach them a lesson and not just say, because my
US
cousin's
colonialism.
cousin. But, put some context into it. And, this is probably a question that a lot of, my friends asked throughout the years and never really had a concrete answer to it. But wouldn't it be nice to actually say, let me teach you a little bit about history.
Yeah.
So pick up a book, Empire of Care, at Amazon. And also you can check out Catherine's website. I think she has a website, CatherineCeniza-Choy.com, right?
That's right.
All right. We'll put it on our little blog. And we just want to say thank you for being our guest.
Well,
Thank you. Thank you.